Hi everyone, in this lecture we are going to talk about pseudo elements. Now pseudo elements are another way of selecting different portions of HTML elements, but the difference between pseudo elements and pseudo classes are that when we used pseudo classes, in no way we created any kind of extra elements on the screen. Right? So pseudo classes were essentially selectors. Pseudo elements are essentially selectors too, but the difference is that pseudo elements allow us to actually generate HTML with CSS. So that HTML that we generate with CSS, that is not going to be available within the HTML document. It is going to be available within the CSS. So we can create HTML within the CSS and we can add it to the screen. And if anyone sees it, they will think that this is HTML, but in fact, that is actually CSS. So with pseudo elements, pseudo classes are selectors. With pseudo elements, we can not only select, but actually generate HTML, create HTML. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a nav. You can think of this as a mini project, because in this lecture, I'm going to show you one of the most important skills. I'm going to teach you one of the most important skills when it comes to creating websites, and that is making a hamburger menu, a hamburger icon, not menu, icon. This is something that you're going to encounter a lot when you are creating websites, and this is used especially for responsive design, and that is when the window gets smaller and smaller to a tablet size. Your website is getting smaller to a tablet size or to a mobile size. You need to hide all the navigation links within another menu, and that menu requires very meticulous design. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you that in this lecture. You can think of it as a mini project that I'm teaching you, and that is done with pseudo elements. And this is going to show you what pseudo elements are actually capable of, and 99.9% of all the awesome transformations, awesome animations that you can see on the web with CSS, 99.9% of them, they are created with pseudo elements. So it is crazy what you can create with pseudo elements. It's like out of this world. It's unbelievable. That's why I'm just teaching you this in the context of a mini project. So we have a nav, and I'm going to create an empty div. So if I save it, nothing is going to be shown on the screen, because these two elements, they do not have any kind of content. All the magic happens in the CSS. Let's dive into CSS. I'm going to start with our nav. I'm going to select it using the element selector. I'm going to give it a height. We have talked about HTML heights. I'm going to give it a height of 50 pixels. And I'm going to give it a width of 50 pixels as well. Then I'm going to give it a background color. The reason that I'm doing height and width is because because the element doesn't have any content. When the element doesn't have any content, this nav element doesn't have any content, the height and width, they're shrunk to 0. That's why you cannot see the element on the screen. So I just want to unshrink it, and I want to enlarge it by 50 pixels in the vertical distance and 50 pixels in the horizontal distance. And I'm going to, because the background is white, I'm just going to give it a different background so we can actually see our navigation on the screen, right? So let's just provide it with 514E. Save that. There we go. So for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to zoom it in to 500 times. Now, we don't have anything in HTML. Everything is being done in CSS. Again, when the element doesn't have any kind of content and you don't provide it with a specific height and width in CSS, the element's height and width are shrunk to 0. That's why you cannot see. The element is there, but you can't see it. So if you want to see it, you need to provide it at least with height and width. If you provide it with just height, the width is going to shrink to 0. You will not be able to see it. If you just provide the height, just the width, the height is going to shrink to 0. So you need to keep that in mind as well. Now I'm going to provide some padding, even though it seems useless now. We are going to talk about this later. Now I'm going to provide three elements, three properties here, not elements. I'm going to write three properties here. These properties are flex properties, flexbox. We are going to cover them in like, I don't know, like let me just take a look. In almost 15, 16 lectures, we are going to talk about flexbox, what it is, what it does, and why you need to master flexbox and grid of all CSS elements. So for now, just go ahead and ignore this. This is for layout purposes. So I'm going to say layout. I'm going to say display flex. This is going to create a flex context. I'm going to say align items center. This is going to center all the items along vertically and justify content. This is going to center all the items horizontally. There we go. We are done with that. Nothing is happening. You're going to see what is going to happen in just a few seconds. Now we have a div. Our div doesn't have a height, doesn't have a width. That's why we can't see it. So let's give it a height of very small, 2 pixels. So I want it to be very slim, very thin. And I'm going to give it a width of 40 pixels. Keep in mind, the parent, which is the nav, it has a width of 50 pixels. The div is going to have the width of 40 pixels. And I'm going to give it a background color of white. And now when I save it, this is going to appear in the middle. Why does it appear in the middle? It's because of this display flex. If I remove these, this is going to appear on top. But if I add these display flags, all these properties, they're used to align elements, to lay out our web pages. There we go. This is going to align it vertically. This is going to align it horizontally, depending on the main and cross axes. We're going to talk about them, don't worry. I'm going to give it a position of relative. We have not talked about positions. We are going to talk about positions. Keep in mind that whenever you're using any kind of pseudo element, what you are going to do is you need to provide some sort of an anchor for that pseudo element, because pseudo elements, they are attached to already created HTML elements. So it's not like you can just create pseudo elements on thin air. It has to have an anchor. It has to have a reference point. It has to have somewhere some element to which it can attach itself. All right, so think of it like that. It has to have a parent element so it can attach itself to that, and then it can show itself later. If there is no element, no div element, no other parent element, pseudo elements, they cannot be created. Keep that in mind. So on the parent of the pseudo element, whichever element is your pseudo element, whichever element is your parent, the parent of the pseudo element, you need to provide the position relative. Position relative provides the parent with an anchor point, with a reference point. Now the pseudo element can successfully attach itself to this div. How can we do that? Now the syntax for a pseudo element resembles almost that of a pseudo class, except pseudo classes, they have 1 colon, pseudo elements, they have 2 colons. So I'm going to say div 2 colons after. After is actually a pseudo element. Now, if I say div after, this is going to create another element after the parent, as the name suggests, but you can change the where this element is going to be generated. But the best practice is that when you say div after, you need to create that after the parent. Like this is the parent, and we are going to create it beneath the parent. We know cascading style sheets, they come from top to bottom. We also have a before pseudo element, which we are going to talk about that as well, and that is going to be generated before the parent. The parent is going to be in the middle, in between. Before it, before pseudo element, after it, after pseudo element. So let's go ahead and let's talk a little bit more about pseudo elements. Now, when it comes to pseudo elements, you need to provide one property, and you cannot escape that. And that is the content. Because you're generating HTML, you need to provide content for that. Now, we don't want to provide any kind of content. Now, if I were to provide content 1, 2, 3, now you can see that this 1, 2, 3, though it cannot be selected, it is being generated by CSS. But we don't want to provide any kind of content. We just want to provide styling. Where do we want this style to appear? So I'm going to say top 10 pixels. What does that mean? It means from this middle line, which is the div, come towards the bottom by how many pixels? By 10 pixels. So where is the reference point? Where is the anchor? The anchor is the div. The div is this white line, this white horizontal line that we can see on the screen. So from this line, come towards the bottom, towards down by 10 pixels. And from left, I don't want to move it by any, so I'm just going to say 0. So if you move it, this line is going to move from the position of its parent. We want it to be to come down by 10 pixels, but we want it to be aligned horizontally and vertically with its parent, so they look good. Now, we are going to provide it with a position absolute. We're going to talk about positions a lot, position relative, position absolute. What basically position absolute does is it is going to take that element out of the document flow. So the document has a certain flow, right? So we have our body, then we have the nav, then we have the div. If you provide position absolute for any of these elements, those elements, they're not going to respect the structure of an HTML document. We have talked about structure of an HTML document. They're not going to respect it. They're going to float around on our web page. Now, when they're floating, you need to provide them with some sort of reference points. That's what we did here. Top 10 pixels, left 0. If you don't provide those with them, with these values, then they might appear anywhere they want. Think of it like that. That's not actually what happens, but it's a good visualization. So what do you want the dimensions of this pseudo element to be? It is an element after all. It is called pseudo, means it's a fake element, but it is still an element, and you need to provide it with some dimensions. If you don't provide it with dimensions, it doesn't have content. It is simply going to shrink to 0. So you need to provide it with some dimensions. I'm going to say height 2 pixels, and width is going to be 40 pixels. The same dimensions as the parent, and I'm going to say background color FFF. If I save it, there we go. So we just created this line after the parent, and it looks exactly like the parent because it has the same dimensions, but it comes 10 pixels towards the bottom. Now I'm going to select all of this, and I'm going to do the same thing for the before pseudo element. The difference is where the pseudo element is going to appear. Now, the before pseudo element, it is going to appear before the container, before the parent, before the div, before the reference point. So it is going to go towards the top. Now, coordinates in CSS, the horizontal coordinate, like the x, negative x, positive x, they work in the same way as in math, in geometry. But the y coordinate is actually the reverse of geometry, unfortunately. So if you go towards the bottom, in geometry, the numbers are going to be -1, -2, and the negative numbers are going to increase. In other words, numbers are going to get smaller and smaller. If you go towards the top, numbers are going to get bigger and bigger. But in CSS, if you go towards the top, numbers are going to get smaller and smaller. And if you come towards the bottom, in a vertical fashion, in a vertical manner, numbers are going to get bigger and bigger. So that's why when we said div after, we came towards the bottom, we had 10 pixels. But in geometry, you would have -10 pixels because you're coming down. It is getting smaller and smaller. But this is how CSS actually works. So when we are going towards the top, numbers are getting smaller. Therefore, we are going to provide it with -10. And voila, we have our pseudo before element. So what we did here is, this is actually a hamburger menu, hamburger icon. If you click this, sometimes this is going to change into a cross. We are going to cover that in our projects. Very, very cool thing. and all of the navigation is going to appear. If you click the cross, it's just going to be converted to three lines, three horizontal lines, and the navigation is going to disappear. We're going to talk about that, don't worry. Now, again, I've explained this process a lot. It's been 15 minutes. I'm not going to explain it a lot. If you don't understand it, just go ahead and rewatch the video. I'm sure you're going to master it. That's it for this lecture. See you in the next one.